let me introduce you the OECD Director for Financial Enterprise Affairs, Carmine Di Noia, who will provide some opening remarks. Carmine, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Anna. Ladies and gentlemen, it's my great honor to welcome you today to the 7th Annual OECD Conference on Investment Treaties. Together with many of you, last year, OECD launched government-led work on the future of investment treaties with the participation of experts and stakeholders. We are exploring how investment treaties can help address new challenges and how to deal with existing agreements in a pragmatic way. Now, we have 3 goals in mind for these treaties. So how they can contribute to sustainable development, how they can help with market access, in particular for green investment, and finally, how they might benefit from a flexible range of implementation mechanisms. Now, the focus of today's conference is investment treaties and climate change, and I hope you liked also the introduction and the introductory video. Confronting the climate crisis forms a core part of the OECD work in general and for the Future of Investment Treaties project. Now, climate change is obviously a very urgent issue with major economic and security implications, and achieving the goals of the 2015 Paris Agreement is critical to overcoming the climate crisis. That agreement, signed by over 190 parties, sets out 2 fundamental goals. First, governments set for the first time a temperature objective to limit global warming to well below 2 and preferably 1.5 degrees Celsius compared to the pre-industrial levels. Second, governments expressly agreed on the objective of making finance flows consistent with a pathway towards low greenhouse gas emissions and climate resilient development. The private sector has an important role to play in developing and implementing coherent and evidence-based sustainable finance practices that promote decarbonization of the energy sector and our wider economies. Many different aspects of our work at the OECD strives to promote and facilitate this role for the private sector. We are working closely on these issues in a G20, G7, and APEC context, but also with partners such as the FSB, IMF, World Bank, IFRS, and BIS. Financial actors have long seen themselves as largely unconcerned by the issue of climate change. Emissions were the concern of operating companies or consumers. Today, banks, insurers, and other financial actors recognize their responsibility for the financed emissions. Many are making commitments to net zero, led by the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, with more than 450 member firms from across the global financial sector, representing more than 130 trillion in assets. This and other action is helping to align finance flows with the Paris Agreement, but more is needed, including from governments, and more may be needed from investment treaties. Now, investment treaties directly affect and promote finance flows with immense possible consequences for climate action around the world. Now, today's first thematic session will consider alignments between the Paris Agreement and investment treaty policies. Specifically, whether investment treaties are helping to make finance flows consistent with a pathway towards low greenhouse gas emissions, so in line with the Paris Agreement goals. The second thematic session will consider the extent to which investment treaties provide governments with sufficient policy space for measures to combat climate change, such as decisions to cease the use of coal. In its 2022 report, Working Group 3 of the UN Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, so the IPCC, expressed concern that many international governance mechanisms still promote fossil fuels. It highlighted the role of investment treaties and investor-state dispute settlement. Massive regulatory and policy changes are needed to address climate change. Concerns have also been expressed about possible financial liability under investment treaties for governments that seek to introduce these changes, which in turn could dissuade necessary government action. The second session will consider how investment treaties can assist governments in taking the necessary measures. Beyond supporting action of climate change, the work on the Future of Investment Treaties project is advancing other strategic priorities at the OECD. Across the OECD, we seek to promote an enabling environment for international investment that supports sustainable and inclusive economic growth and efficient, stable, and sound financial systems. The Future of Investment Treaties program advances these objectives by doing three things: by supporting a rule-based investment system and evidence-based investment policymaking. Second, by promoting investment that contributes towards better, fairer, and more sustainable economies and recovery from the pandemic. And last, by helping governments to ensure that investment treaties are a tool to achieve these goals. So to conclude, ladies and gentlemen, to all participants, then your number today is in this conference confirms the strong interest in these issues and the importance of aligning investment treaties and other international governance tools with the Paris Agreement. We must use every policy tool at our disposal to tackle the climate crisis. So I'm confident that today's exchanges will take us another step towards realizing these goals. So let me wish you all very fruitful discussion today, and I thank you very much for the attention and giving the floor back to Anna, I think.
Thanks a lot, Carmine, for these good opening remarks, and we appreciated that you took the time and provide us with this kind of a big framework of the meeting. Now I will give the floor to Lauge Poulsen. This Professor Lauge Poulsen. He will provide an overview. Lauge has been supporting our work on the future of treaties, have been chairing an important part of this. That means that we welcome his overview of this topic. Lauge, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Anna. So as a starting point, let me also just set the stage and give a bit of background for today's conference. As Carmine mentioned, OECD initiated a two-track process for discussions about investment treaty reform last year. I'm chairing the first of these tracks, which focuses on the big and important questions facing the regime, and governments have invited us to have climate change as the overriding and cross-cutting theme. And there are several reasons for that. And one is that if we look outside the investment policy community, discussions around investment treaties are increasingly honing in on climate. By the outside world, at least, investment policymakers are increasingly seen as climate policymakers. And that's the case whether they negotiate new treaties or not, whether they reform old treaties or not. And that's not just coming from traditional critics of ISDS or the NGO community. It's also coming from the Financial Times, for instance, which earlier this year noted that investment treaties need to be considered in light of their impact on climate. As Carmine mentioned, it's coming from the UN's Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC, which in its government-approved report earlier this year noted concerns about the role of investment treaties for international climate policy. And it's coming from some of the world's leading experts on international investment law. You'll see this among the many submissions to OECD's public consultation on climate change and investment treaties earlier this year. And just last week, one of the world's most widely read academic journals, Science, published research also calling attention to the risks of ISDS targeting global climate action. So there is growing focus on the climate implications of investment treaties, and a number of governments have started to seriously think about how to address this in their treaty practice. But they need ideas, they need solutions, because I don't think it's far-fetched to expect that over the coming years, this is going to intensify, and the impact on climate policy will likely become a main yardstick, perhaps the most important yardstick, against which this regime and its architects will be judged. As a result, governments have now asked the OECD to start the first sustained multilateral discussions on this topic. And we started last month by introducing the themes we'll cover today, based both on the submissions to our public consultation and the work done by the OECD Secretariat. And let me just briefly summarize 3 themes that have stood out thus far, which will also be important today. First of all, there are the commitments that states have made in the Paris Agreement. Specifically, work from the OECD Secretariat suggests that the finance clause of the Paris Agreement, Article 2.1c, could have material implications for investment treaty policy. In that provision, states have agreed to align finance flows with climate objectives, and this has resulted in a lot of work within the world of finance, including central banks, including export credit agencies, based on a very particular logic. And the logic is quite simple. If you finance an investment, if you insure an investment, and that investment results in carbon emissions, well, then you own part of those emissions. And it doesn't matter if those emissions happen at home or if they happen on the other side of the planet. If you help facilitate them, if you help promote them, if you help enable them, you own them. That's the underlying logic from the Paris Agreement increasingly being applied to finance, to investment insurance, and which has prompted not just financial institutions and insurers, but also regulators to focus on how to align with net zero objectives. And the question is whether a similar logic applies to investment treaties, whether it should apply, and if so, what that would actually entail in practice. And one of the things that came out of discussions in Track 1 last month is that this is a different question than our more familiar discussions about policy space. When an export credit agency looks at the carbon profile of its underwriting portfolio, the question is not whether the underlying risks being insured against, say expropriation, strike the right balance between private and public interests. That's not the question. The question is whether the assets that are being insured are carbon intensive or not. So the focus is on the nature of the investment portfolio that's being supported, being promoted, not the nature of the policy risk. And if that logic is transported into the world of investment treaties, it raises questions insofar as the treaties are part of the incentive structure for carbon intensive assets and activities. So that's one theme. Another theme, when we do talk about policy space, is the global nature of this challenge. Because a number of governments are in fact reforming or getting out of treaties where climate policy issues seem to be at the forefront, like the Energy Charter. And those efforts are important. But insofar as they're about climate concerns, they should logically just be the beginning. Because the global climate doesn't care about where carbon emissions come from. A ton of carbon from Europe will have the same effect as a ton of carbon from Africa or Asia, Latin America. So if the concern is about climate, a rational government should not just care about its own policy space, but also the policy space of its treaty partners. In fact, it should care about policy space across the global treaty network. Because if a government spends billions trying to get out of coal at home, it doesn't really make sense to have a network of treaties in place that increase the cost of treaty partners to get out of coal abroad. In climate terms, that's money out the window. So even if Energy Charter reforms are successful, focus will naturally start flowing towards the global web of bilateral investment treaties with similar protections for carbon intensive activities. And the final theme is the timeline for reform. Now, not everyone agrees that reforms are needed, but if a group of governments suggests that the treaties do in fact need to be adjusted in light of the climate emergency, well then the clock is ticking fast. IPCC has noted time and again that policies to support the energy transition cannot wait, and reforms made 5, 10, 15 years from now will be much less effective than reforms made over the coming years. And that's very important, as this is a regime that has proven remarkably resistant to change, and a regime where policy teams tend to be very small, often underfunded, and already overstretched. So if this is in fact a priority, then rapid attention will probably need help and support from, say, the OECD. So 3 themes have flown from these discussions thus far. 1, the logic flowing from the Paris Agreement and the finance and insurance community is becoming increasingly clear. If you finance it, if you insure it, if you facilitate it, if you promote it, you own it. 2nd, if you're concerned with climate policy space at home, you should logically be concerned with climate policy space abroad as well. By just working towards policy space for yourself, you're in effect possibly pushing emissions abroad, carbon leakage. Finally, If one has concerns with the climate implications of investment treaties and efforts to reform the Energy Charter suggest that some states do, well, then it inherently becomes an urgent issue. And that's why colleagues in trade, and particularly in finance, are moving fast in trying to align their regimes with climate objectives. They're clearly not there yet, but they're moving much faster than the reform efforts we are used to in this regime. So part of the aim of today's conference is to think about these themes that have come up in the work of the OECD Secretariat, come up in a public consultation, come up in our discussion so far under track 1, and provide the basis for our continued engagement on this topic.